Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 15. I'm your host, Dan Attrell, and today we're going to talk about the Buddha. So let's get right into it. What is right conduct? Right action? What am I able to know? What is it that I should do? And perhaps a question which would become more and more popular as we move through the axial age: how can I be saved from this whole mess of existence, fraught with all its seeming contradictions? These are the types of questions we ought to ask ourselves, and the types of questions men and women have been asking themselves since time immemorial. Now, long before the appearance of philosophy in any formal sense of the word, questions like these were engaged by persons or communities throughout the world. Philosophy, quote-unquote philosophy, as we know it, came on the scene at a rather late stage in cultural development. We're already in the 6th and 5th centuries BC in our chronology, and only now Pythagoras is proclaiming to be the first ever lover of wisdom vis-a-vis the problem of knowledge, governance, and conduct. Well, let's consider the period from 800 to 600 BC, as we've been doing, wherein there were all sorts of remarkable developments from the Celtic world to the Hindu world. These were developments which were pre-philosophical, but still very much in line with the same sorts of questions, and very much in line with the same spirit of inquiry. In ages long past, when the world of men was young, this sort of wisdom might have been borne in by the flights of an augure's birds, by the omens or revelations or oracles or prophecies and visions of a shaman, or perhaps in the voice of a goddess. Very often, it was the counsel of a wise man one sought. One sat at the foot of a great sage, secluded on his mountain, and addressed their questions to them. This is where we get the etymology of the word Upanishad, that great body of Indian spiritual literature. The word carries the connotation of sitting next to, very much like the later medieval Kabbalah, derived from rabbinical Hebrew kibel, to receive or to accept. Between 800 and about 300 BC, the Hindus developed this Upanishadic tradition to address questions regarding conduct, knowledge, and how to live the right sort of life. Now, obviously, the India of this period was no monolithic entity, so it had no one great teacher, no one great philosophy, and no one great world view. The intellectual landscape of India was an extremely complex patchwork of both local and foreign religions, philosophies, superstitions, and skepticisms. The teacher we're going to discuss today, however, would change the face of this Indian religion forever by essentially stripping the whole thing down for export into East Asia and leaving behind all its nuanced and multifaceted complexities in favor of a more simple path, which held compassion at its core, rather than trying to understand or elaborate a Baroque cosmology of infinite layers of existence that endless wheel populated by gods and demigods and demons and heroes and paupers and so forth. Today, we're going to discuss the Buddha, and I'm going to explain why I think he's so important, both to world history in general, but also within the context of Hermetic history. So, I should start by saying that there's no such thing as a Buddhist Bible, in the sense of an authoritative and canonized body of texts vis-a-vis the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. Now, obviously, there are good reasons for this, given that Buddhism is quite ancient relative to Western Gnosticisms like Neoplatonism, Christianity, Hermeticism, Mandaeanism, Manichaeism, and various other fully fleshed out mystery traditions of the Mediterranean basin. Why is this, you ask? Well, the first reason is because the Buddhist recognizes no authority, neither human nor divine. They recognize no authority as to what is truth, with a capital T. Even the Buddha himself claimed no authority. We are to, quote, work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, to quote Paul in Philippians 2:12 out of its original context. Now, the second reason Buddhism has no official text or doctrine is somewhat of a more practical one. It's because the geographic, demographic, chronological, and linguistic expanse into which Buddhism flourished made such voluminous work that it would be impossible to collect, codify, canonize, and compile it all. Buddhism as a moral and ethical philosophy of living, which branched out from the Buddha's name, was forged in the intellectual fires of northeastern India, in what we might today call Nepal. This was in the 6th century BC, approximately. Within a millennium of its earliest formulation, the philosophy traveled to at least 10 neighboring countries, each with a number of different languages, amidst which its volume of scriptures has been growing slowly but surely in various monasteries, schools, and hermitages. Among these scriptures are included what today we call sutras. These are sermons allegedly given by the Buddha himself, though few would claim, unlike modern-day Christians, that any of these sutras or sermons were in fact the very words of Prince Gautama. Even if they were the words of the master, they would be refused as dogmatically binding by a true Buddhist. In a famous passage of Buddhist scripture, the Buddha tells his followers to rely on no authority whatsoever unless it is in accord with one's own reason and experience. Unless it eases the passage toward nirvana, extinguishment, the great snuffing out of life's candle. So, what is it then that binds all these sutras together? It's that they all pertain to the Buddha's enlightenment or awakening, and that they are all based on the teaching of the so-called Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths. The rest of these writings concern what's called the middle path, the path that all men must take to work out their own salvation toward supreme liberation, toward moksha, satori, bodhi mind, prajna, enlightenment, whatever you'd like to call seeing the world as it truly is, not obscured by a mask of words, disguised by a veil of worries, and choked out by the fetters of fear and desire. So, what do we make of this lack of authority? This external spiritual anarchy coupled by internal monarchy? Well, the first thing we can say is that Buddhism isn't bound by any specific event in history. It's an ahistorical philosophy. It doesn't rely on the wanderings of a Moses, the crucifixion of a Christ, or the prophecies of a Muhammad for its legitimacy. For all intents and purposes, the story I'm going to tell you about the Buddha may very well not have happened, and that's totally irrelevant to the poignancy, the veracity, and the applicability of the message behind the myth, behind the story, the mythos. Now, I would argue the case is the same in regards to a Christ or a Moses, but obviously most scripturally oriented literalists would vehemently disagree with me, but they can go make their own lectures if they're so inclined. The story of Prince Gautama could just as well, and in all likelihood already has, unfolded in an LA, in New York, in a Paris, a London, or wherever. One might think of the story of St. Francis, or of any other wealthy youths having undergone a mystical experience and become sensitive to the suffering and injustice of the world around them. It's an archetypal tale that transcends time and space, and it's for this reason that the Buddhist believes not only in the manifold plurality of ascended men and women, but also in the potential for himself or herself to do the same. Whether or not the quote-unquote Buddha we're so familiar with ever lived is entirely irrelevant, because the story of his life is, potentially, the story of our own lives, if we're able to recover that lost continent of the soul, compassion. Compassion, literally from the Latin, suffering together, sharing the burden of existence, coming down out of a position of privilege and giving up oneself to the all, onto the extinguishment of personal desires, onto the extinguishment of all desires. Now, a question which was largely discussed during the Axial Age was the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why do people suffer? Well, in the polytheistic societies of, say, Homeric Greece or Vedic India, this was never really a question. Fortune was thought to wax and wane, and every event, for good or for ill, was thought to be the machinations of some god or another. An earthquake collapsed your house and killed your family? Well, that's Poseidon's senseless wrath at work. War has consumed everything you know? Well, Indra may be to blame for that one. Now, in a worldview that is either monotheistic, or which sees the gods as just another rung on that great stepladder of existence, we started to ask ourselves more seriously, whence comes suffering? the Christians would ultimately come to attribute this to Adam's original sin. The saying goes, "The wages of sin is death." We die because of Adam's sin. After eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God put a curse on man and said, quote, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face shall you eat bread, till you return onto the ground, for of it you are taken, for dust you are, and unto dust shall you return." So, there you have a Western conception of the origin of suffering. From having the knowledge of good and evil. From having the knowledge of discrimination. Self-awareness, essentially, was the source of suffering. Well, over in the East, things were a bit different. In fact, things were actually reversed. Ignorance, not knowledge of good and evil, was the sole source of suffering. And this plays into the cosmology of the East, a cosmology which I personally believe in. So, the problem of existence in the eyes of a Buddhist, and I would say so too in the eyes of a subtle-minded Christian or Muslim or what have you, is that life is a zero-sum game. Winner takes all. Be the broken or the breaker. We might say that the good Lord, throned in his grand indifference, erred in the making of this universe insofar as half the world exists by enslaving and eating the other half. There are the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the fat and the thin, the healthy and the sick, the beautiful and the ugly. The universe is a closed system of ones and zeros with obvious levels of gradation in between. This is the Hermetic principle of polarity at work. Ultimately, among the have-nots, there's a constant thirst for attainment, for keeping up with the Joneses, for never really living in the present as it's painful, and thus constantly longing for a bright future which may never actually come. This longing, in turn, is itself more pain, because desire is pain. And this constant cycle of not having and desire, this oscillation between two dissatisfactions, leads to a soul trapped in a psychic prison. We'll get back to this in a minute. I just want to mention as an interesting fact that this concept, or rather this law, is not so alien to the West as we may think, at least not in a postmodern world. It even lays at the foundations of Marxism and its prediction of an inevitable apocalypse inherent to every capitalist system. It's at the root of every revolution, and it rears its ugly face again at the end of every revolution. Every great leveling yields once more, over time, to inequality, because it's inherent to nature itself. Now, that aside, before we drink, generally, it's because we're thirsty. That's to say, when we feel the pain of emptiness, whether in regards to food, water, sex, wealth, and so forth, we long to be filled. Once we've sated these desires, we're comfortable, but it'll only be so long until that desire returns. So what is the rich man, the man who easily satisfies all his desires? What does he do to ensure he will always have enough to drink? Well, he fences off his well to all the others and watches them die in the streets to ensure the security of his next feast. We can see this happening in South America right now. Among these haves, there's a burning desire to keep the status quo rolling in order to avoid suffering. There's this constant clinging to the pleasure of the present in a world where everything flows, where everything is ephemeral and transitory. This clinging we call fear, and it's most manifest in the attempts of the haves to control. Thus, the haves use what they have to keep the have-nots down and out. In turn, they themselves suffer from it. They suffer isolation, for there are far more have-nots than haves. They suffer boredom, since the challenges they face in life do not satisfy them. And most importantly, they suffer fear. Fear of loss, fear of the very flow of time, which ultimately devours everything. And this is the only constant in the universe. Change is the only constant. So, to flesh this out, I think it's important to talk about the context from which Buddhism emerged. That is, from the context of Iron Age India and its rigidly stratified caste system. Because all of this makes even more sense if you take into consideration their worldview. Underpinning all of this stuff I've been talking about is the inevitability of reincarnation. If death is the off, well then life is the on switch. You can't have one without the other. So if death is darkness, then life is light. Again, you cannot have one without the other. In order for anything to happen, there must be an oscillation, a flux between varied states. Well then, what is it that contains these opposites within itself? Let's zoom out our scope for a minute. At the very top of the great chain of being, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to call it the great chain of being itself, is Brahma, God, the One. That great, ineffable source from whom, or better yet, from which, all multiplicity must ultimately be rooted in. Now this Brahma is no image of a Near Eastern despot or of a bearded man who judges mankind from his throne, and this is the wholly transcendent yet wholly immanent reconciler of every paradox. Brahma is the boundless void and the boundless light, the God beyond gods, beyond good and evil. In short, the all, and then some. Every god, every man, every beast is Brahma in disguise on a quest to know itself. We live, we die, we live again and again and again and again at various levels of that great chain of being. We're all aspects of Brahma at play. Brahma who is perfect, whole, complete, and beautifully indifferent stillness. Now, the problem, if you consider life a problem, which is the problem, is that we've fallen short of the glory of Brahma because we are not whole. We are not one. We are abscised from the great source of all being by an illusion, by a veil or a curtain, which separates the ultimate self from that great undivided self. This separation, this thing which stands in the way of us seeing things as they really are, the Hindu calls Maya, the great veil of illusion. Now, in English, where does this word illusion come from? It stems from the Latin verb ludere, which means to play. God is in a dance with itself. And part of this big game of pretend is to break itself up into an infinite number of tiny little pieces and put itself back together again, like a giant jigsaw puzzle. This division, this self-shattering, we could say, is the source of all suffering. It's a longing for return to the cosmic womb of oneness. The individuated soul, which of course is but an imperfect copy of that grand oversoul called Atman, comes into being. It incarnates, it takes on flesh here in this fallen world, wherein it's virtually bound to become unsatisfied, cling, fear, desire, and thus become subject to an eternal return, with each incarnation designed to deliver the message that all this pain, all this separation, all this is illusion. All of this is Maya. We only think this world is fallen because we can't see the forest for the trees. We suffer because we're ignorant to the truth. Whether God, man, or insect, every being is trapped in the great chain of attainment, longing to return to the one, but unsure as to how to do it. Now, let's turn to the myth of Prince Gautama and examine it with this frame of mind. As the story goes, Prince Siddhartha Gautama was the son of a lesser noble somewhere in northeast India or Nepal, sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. Obviously, these sorts of national distinctions are irrelevant to the time we're talking about. This kind of thing is hotly debated. When a famous person is born somewhere, there's always some sort of nationalistic fervor to try to claim that person, like Buddha or Alexander the Great or whatnot. This is all irrelevant because nationalism is a very recent phenomenon, and it has no bearing on what we're talking about here. Now, our earliest extant sources of this story comes from the 3rd century AD. Not that that matters at this point. The story begins with an immaculate conception. On the night that Siddhartha was conceived, his mother, aptly named Maya, dreamt of a white elephant with 6 tusks entering her side. 10 months later, she brought a child into this world. I think the parallels with the other well-known hero myths can go unmentioned. Now, the legend goes that Maya died in giving birth to her son, whom was given the name Siddhartha, meaning he who achieves his aim. If we want to translate this in Western Christian terms, we might say, he who stopped sinning. Since sin is an archery term, which means missing the target, missing the mark. That target, of course, being the perfection, the wholeness, or the completeness of God or Brahma. During the celebration of Siddhartha's birth, like the shepherds or the magi who came to visit Christ, a hermit seer named Asita had journeyed down from his mountaintop retreat. We could probably call this guy a yogi or a gymnosophist, if that helps your imagination. Well, he breaks into the party and ominously announces to the assembled crowd that, based on a birthmark he bore, this newborn child would ultimately become one of 2 things: a great king or a great sadhu, a great have or a great have-not. Sadhu is a Sanskrit word which just means good man, and it essentially refers to an ascetic who's dedicated to the task of moksha, or liberation, breaking free from the endless wheel of birth, desire, death, and rebirth. Well, being the son of a wealthy nobleman in a patriarchal society obsessed with wealth, caste, and status, you can imagine how Siddhartha's father took the news. So, having a full understanding of what this sort of thing implied, Siddhartha's father quickly got to work at building a veritable pleasure dome for his son. His palace was stocked with all manner of fineries, with beautiful women, exotic luxury goods, nice clothes, good food, these kinds of things. Any servant or member of the household who appeared sick or suffering, Siddhartha's father sent away so that his son would not be distracted from his path to kingship. Siddhartha spent his whole youth in this lifestyle, experiencing every luxury and excessive earthly pleasure you can imagine, with virtually no concept of the world which lay beyond the palace walls. He eventually gets married and has a son, which is a vital step towards kingship and a critical step backwards from liberation, since getting married and having children are two of the greatest forms of attachment we can experience in this world. So, from Siddhartha's father's perspective, everything's going along swimmingly. At this point, Siddhartha is about 29 years of age. So, much like Arthur Schopenhauer once said, and I'm paraphrasing, life is an endless oscillation between desire and boredom. Siddhartha's life in the palace, where his every desire was fulfilled, eventually began to yield to boredom. Siddhartha wanted nothing more than to leave the palace walls, which he'd inhabited for 29 years, and to see the world beyond. His father, naturally, would have none of it, since he full well understood what kind of horrors lay outside that little bubble he built for his son. So, one day, having had enough of his father's repression, Siddhartha boldly confronted him and announced that he was going to go out and meet his subjects. Siddhartha's father then essentially tells him to wait a minute while he goes out and does a couple things. And then afterwards, he would be allowed to go walk the streets. So, what does his father go do? He gets his servants to basically run outside and clear the riffraff from the streets. Anyone who was old or sick or dying or whatever, he forced them out of the streets so that his son wouldn't see any of it. In the places where I've lived, we have something like this today. Our big papa in the sky, aka the government, pays a bunch of drones called police to clear the streets of these sort of things so we can all go about our lives ignorant to the suffering of others. In any case, despite all his father's best intentions, Siddhartha sets out in his chariot, let's say the Ferrari of his day. This is a profound symbol of aristocratic rule. And despite all of his father's best efforts, he still manages to stumble upon 4 sights which would change his life forever. The first of these was an emaciated man starving in the streets. He was so thin he could barely sit on the floor without experiencing constant discomfort. The second was an aged man, his back bent by years of toil and his face all creased and pockmarked from a century beneath the sun. The third was the decaying corpse of a man, pulsating with maggots, swirling with flies, and being eaten by carrion birds. Then, the last and most important of these sights was that of a sadhu, of a monk, sitting beneath a tree in meditation. Well, something in Siddhartha's heart lit up, which was very atypical of someone in his position. The doctrine of metempsychosis preached in Hinduism reasoned these sorts of things away by saying that these people must have done something in a past life for which they're now atoning. It was thought to be their karma. their doing, the sum of every action they had taken in all their previous incarnations. So, Siddhartha turned to his charioteer, his chauffeur, and asked him about these things. Well, this charioteer, named Channa, who himself would eventually become a disciple of the Buddha and attain some form of arhathood, turned to Siddhartha and explained to him the human condition. Most people live, toil, break down, get sick, and die, then return again and again to experience this lot until the world is dissolved and made anew. Well, this sort of news threw Siddhartha into a bout of depression which he just couldn't shake. He returned to his ivory tower to confirm every fear his father had had for him. And no amount of sex or feasting or lounging about would break him from this spell. And so, eventually, in the dead of the night, Siddhartha escaped his palace, his family, all of his luxuries, and decided to take up the life of an ascetic, such as the one lived by the monk he had seen beneath the tree on the side of the road. Siddhartha left the principality of his father so that he might not be discovered, and he began by throwing away all of his expensive clothes and took to begging on the street. Now, the king of the neighboring city in which he was begging stumbled upon him and immediately recognized him to be a prince. Then and there, this king offered Siddhartha his throne, but, of course, he rejected it. This would be the first of many temptations on his path. Siddhartha then went to study under a number of great spiritual teachers who taught him the arts of asceticism, and although he excelled at their practice, if one can really excel at torturing oneself, this is a paradox after all, he eventually left his teachers and set out on his own. Like Plotinus once said, life is a flight from the alone to the alone. And getting caught up in that whole skin game of gurus and elaborate games of submission was not for Siddhartha. Ever unsatisfied and ever desiring not to desire, Siddhartha took to more and more extreme practices of asceticism. He tried voluntary starvation, self-mortification, exposure to the elements, and so forth. He grew so thin and weak that he started collapsing and verging on the edge of death. Now, if you want to see some really graphic artwork of this period of the Buddha's path, look at some images of the quote-unquote emaciated Buddha, of which there are many. At that moment, Siddhartha came to the realization that if he kept going down this path of self-denial, that he would simply die having achieved nothing, and he would return on the wheel having to undergo this entire process all over again. To be born again, potentially in a far less privileged state than he was born into in his current incarnation, to suffer again, and so forth. Now, just a quick aside for a minute. After this incident of Siddhartha's near-death experience, we have the climax of our story. Siddhartha sits himself down beneath a great fig tree, which today, as the result of Siddhartha's awakening into what is called Bodhi mind, we call this a Bodhi tree. Now, sitting beneath this great pillar of heaven, this axis mundi, Siddhartha vows that he will not get up and move until he has discovered the truth. It's safe to say that at this point, Siddhartha began to take up the practice of meditation. No longer would he torment his body on the one hand, but neither would he indulge in excessive luxuries either. All he did was sit and perceive the world around him, watching his thoughts go by like clouds on an overcast day. Now, up to this point, Siddhartha had had companions who'd been following him around, doing all sorts of ascetic things together on their mutual quest to transcend the body. At this point, all of these guys bail. They figure in renouncing the ascetic practices that Siddhartha has grown soft and that he was no longer interested in relinquishing the flesh. So there he sat for days on end, like a stone image of himself, not flinching or budging, surely being devoured by flies and mosquitoes and accosted by all sorts of temptations. Now, at this point, along comes Mara, a great demon who, not to make too strict of an analogy, is roughly equivalent to Satan in the story of Christ's temptation in the desert. You can do with this figure what you will. If you want to imagine a great seductive demon lord making all sorts of false promises to Siddhartha, knock yourself out. I prefer to rationalize this character and perceive him as a poetic personification of negative emotions. Fear, doubt, anxiety, and so forth. So here, Mara and his 3 daughters, Tanha, which is craving, Arati, which is aversion and discontentment, and Raga, which is attachment or desire or greed. These demons assault Siddhartha with all manner of temptations. Our hero, however, is steadfast in his meditation, and he remains unmoved by this horde of evil spirits. The traditional number of days which Siddhartha sat in meditation is 49, and thereafter, in the 35th year of his life, our dear Prince Siddhartha gets it. He wakes up. And from this point on, the good prince would be known to us as a Buddha, an enlightened being. I say a Buddha and not the Buddha because traditionally there have been many Buddhas before Siddhartha, and there would be many to come afterwards. Jesus, I would argue, was a Buddha. So too was Plotinus, St. Francis, Rumi, and so forth. These are people who saw the world the way it really is, absent from our mind-forged manacles. Then, seeing it that way, they took up the path of compassion, of suffering in the world, with the world. They took this path instead of using that gnosis for personal gain, which is another option they could have taken. This today we call the so-called left-hand path, or the satanic path. if we can be so free to use that term. It's the raising of duality above unity. In any case, I'm digressing here. So, when I say he wakes up, what do I mean? Well, it's at this point that the Buddha recognized the so-called Four Noble Truths. The first of these is the truth of suffering, of dukkha. And that is that all conditional phenomena and all experience is not ultimately satisfying. In layman's terms, life is suffering. And now let me explain why. And this brings us to our second truth. This is the truth of the origin of suffering. And that is that suffering stems from desire itself. Craving for and clinging to what is pleasurable, and then on the flip side, trying to avoid what isn't pleasurable, is what leads to our eternal coming into existence and eternal dissatisfaction, our ceaseless deaths, and our inevitable rebirths. No matter how successful we are never satisfied. Even pleasure is tinged with suffering because ultimately it must end. Sorrow ever awaits on joy. This all stems from ignorance of ourselves. We feel a void or a vacuum within us, and we're constantly seeking this way or that to fill that void, but we never actually get satisfied. We sate our hunger only to become hungry again for more, and so on it goes. And that, of course, is only on the biological level. We get addicted to other people. We get addicted to our opinions, our ideas, our possessions, and so forth. Clinging to all of these things, which are ultimately transitory, can end in nothing but suffering. Okay, so what are we to do about this mess that we've been born into? Well, that's where the third truth comes into play. This is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And it's the idea that we actually can put an end to this endless wheel of craving and clinging in order that rebirth, dissatisfaction, and re-death can no longer arise. So, now that we know that one can actually end suffering, let's find out what the good doctor prescribes. This is what's called, quote unquote, the truth of the path of liberation from suffering. And it's that by following what is called the Noble Eightfold Path, we can put an end to craving, to clinging, to becoming, to rebirth, to dissatisfaction, and to re-death. Okay, so those are the Four Noble Truths according to the awakened Siddhartha Gautama, who I will now simply refer to as the Buddha. Although, like I mentioned, we should remember that he is merely a Buddha, and that there is no the Buddha unless you want to make an argument that all those who awaken realize the illusion of self, and thus recognize that all individuated Buddhas are really just different faces of the same God or Brahma. Now, the Four Noble Truths now lead us to the Noble Eightfold Path, or in short, the middle path. That is, the middle between harsh asceticism, the rejection of the flesh, and opulent luxury, the indulgence of the flesh, both of which are roads to more and more suffering. So the Noble Eightfold Path, or the Middle Path, is essentially the fourth truth. I'm going to list these 8 aspects quickly and then flesh them out. They are 1. Right view. 2. Right intention. 3. Right speech. 4. Right action. 5. Right livelihood. 6. Right effort. 7. Right mindfulness. And 8. Right concentration. Now, just before I dig into these, I should mention that these are not progressive phases. All of these things need to be worked on simultaneously rather than one at a time. They are like threads in a rope rather than steps on a staircase. And by no means can I give a comprehensive account of these 8 aspects. One could run an entire course on this subject alone, so don't expect me to give you the big picture in the time that we've got. Okay, so what is right view? Right view, if I had to say it in the fewest words possible, is seeing the world as it really is. It's seeing the world beyond words. So when you look at the space around you, this spatial anomaly, you aren't parsing every little thing into words and then boldly proclaiming to yourself, I know these things, just because you have a label for them. Now, not to point fingers, but scientists these days are the worst for this kind of behavior. They think they truly know something because they have a small mouth noise for it, and maybe a small mouth noise for its function in the form of a verb. We're in a prison of words, and we're caught up in many illusions which words create. All this is Maya, and it needs to be pierced. So the practice of meditation is all about overcoming this issue. It's sitting still, doing nothing, and seeing the world openly. Letting it flow into you and then out of you without making any judgments, discriminations, or whatnot. A very dirty word in Buddhism is I. And part of having the right view is seeing beyond this illusion of ego, because it's just a formality of grammar and has no actual basis in the world. Do you breathe or are you breathed? Do you pump your heart or does it just happen? Most of your body is comprised of all different kinds of bacteria which don't even carry your DNA, but ultimately are absolutely essential to your functioning. Are these you? The water, the minerals, all the things which compose your body, which are constantly flowing in and out of you? The cells which completely cycle through your body at least every 6 years? Are these you? No, they aren't. Because you or I are just words, and living in the shadow of these words will set you down a path of suffering. Because when you don't see the world as it is, you see an illusion instead. Therein lies suffering. Suffering, in the neurotic sense of the word, comes entirely from ignorance. So, whenever possible, try to see the world beyond words. beyond the arbitrary discriminating lines we create with our grammar. Now, obviously, a little bit of ego is good. It lets you know which hole to cram food into, and which body to bathe, and so forth. But that's about it. Okay, so there's much more to be said about this, but if I take too long, we'll never get through this talk. There have been thousands and thousands of commentaries, digests, interpretations, and so forth on these concepts, and I can by no means give an exhaustive description of these, as I mentioned before. I suppose the last thing that I should mention about right view is that it presupposes that you've got the Hindu cosmology down pat, since if you don't think we reincarnate, which we do, whether you believe it or not, even if you're a materialist, you can't deny that the cells in our body break down, escape the outward circumference of our bodies, and then are recycled into new forms of life, which come into consciousness in the world where others left off. But in any case, if you don't think we reincarnate, then Buddhism is pretty much pointless to you. A die-hard materialist, reductionist atheist, for example, would have you believe that when you die, that's it. Your body rots in the ground and your consciousness goes with it, since it's merely some epiphenomenal iridescence tenuously hovering above matter. Well, from the Buddhist perspective, complete extinguishment is the highest goal. It's called nirvana, which means extinguishment, like when you blow out a candle. One could only be so lucky to get out of this hell of perpetual existence. And until one gets it right, one will be back again and again and again to the hell we've all created until the lessons which we need to learn have been learned. Now, part 2 of the path is right intention. The Buddha explained right intention in a threefold manner. The intention of renunciation, the intention of goodwill, and the intention of harmlessness. Opposite to these are the 3 wrong types of intention: intention governed by desire, intention governed by ill will, and intention governed by harmfulness. Renunciation overcomes desire, goodwill overcomes ill will, and harmlessness overcomes harmfulness. In short, make the right choices. Natural law dictates your rights end when harm to another begins. So be conscious of how your actions and words ripple outward, and make a concerted effort to renounce desire, maintain goodwill, and to eliminate harm. This will ensure that your karma, the sum of your actions, will not drag you down the path most of mankind has gone down, which is what's gotten us into the predicament we're in to begin with. Now remember that we're not working from a system of Judeo-Christian morality here, so what is right and wrong is somewhat different to the Buddhist, though there is a great deal of overlap. Here's some primary instances of unwholesome karma or action according to the Buddha. Destroying life, hence why Orthodox Buddhists are vegetarians. Taking what is not given, which is really the ultimate crime, since all sins, so to speak, are really just various forms of theft, attempts to take something which doesn't belong to one, whether that's property, happiness, their lives, or whatnot. There's also wrong conduct in regard to sense pleasure. There is false speech, which is telling lies, slanderous speech, harsh words, idle chatter, covetousness, ill will, etc. So, if we want to think of what is right intention, we can probably apply an apophatic model and say that right intention is an intention which does not involve harming, which does not involve destroying, which does not involve lying, coveting, etc. We know what is right by knowing what is not right. The word intention in Latin means leaning toward. So we've got to lean toward what is right by identifying what is not right first. Remember, right intention is threefold. It covers renunciation, which is saying no to desire. We've got good will, which is saying no to ill will. And we've got harmlessness, which is saying no to harm. This apophasis, this saying of no, is a natural outgrowth of the understanding that all things are in polarity, and that as humans, we ought to strive toward the good to be freed from our ignorance and suffering. With right view comes right intention, and from these comes right speech, action, and so forth. One who recognizes karmic law, that is, that every action brings about an equal and opposite reaction or consequence, will frame his pursuits to accord with this law. Thus, one's actions, expressive of one's intentions, will conform to the principles of right conduct. So let's take greed for an example, which is really an outgrowth of fear, which itself is an outgrowth of ignorance. Greed is essentially a thought pattern, and the way to fight this thought pattern is to practice its polar opposite, which in this case is renunciation. If you actively practice renunciation, you can ultimately dissolve greed. Since contrary thoughts can't exist in one mind, thoughts of renunciation dissolve thoughts of desire, thus causing non-greed to replace greed. This is a fundamental practice in Buddhism, and also a practice which figures extensively in what many 19th century occultists would come to deem spiritual alchemy. Okay, so let's move on. We're now going to cover the three parts of the Eightfold Path together: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. I should start by mentioning that the English word morality suggests a sense of obligation, of constraint to and by God. And this is quite foreign to the Buddhist conception of right conduct. Buddhism, with its generally non-theistic framework, has its ethics grounded upon the notion of harmony, not just obedience for the sake of obedience. One lives a life of quote-unquote right conduct because it is an end in and of itself, not because it was given as a command on the heights of Horeb, then buttressed with threats of punishment. Okay, so let's start with right speech. This is broken up into 4 parts. The first of these parts is abstaining from lies. The second is abstaining from slander. The third is abstaining from harsh words. And the fourth is my favorite, abstaining from idle chatter. So, the capacity for verbal expression. whether it's oral or written, has generally been regarded as the distinguishing mark of the human species. Both the spoken word and its derivative, the written word, can have enormous consequences either for good or for harm. Words can destroy people. Words can share wisdom. They can create enemies. They can start wars. But they can also appease hostilities, and they can create peace. And in our modern age, the ambivalent potential of speech has been vastly multiplied by that exponential increase of connections between us. So we really need to make language a tool for human excellence rather than a tool for human degradation. The first way to do this coincides with the commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." Or, in more simple terms, don't lie. According to the Buddha, we need to both avoid telling lies and consciously practice speaking the truth. Now, all this goes back to the origins of suffering and the way to remedy it. As I've mentioned numerous times by now, suffering comes about from ignorance and illusion. And what is more ignorance and illusion producing than lies? Words can only bring suffering when delusion is the principal motive. If we all lied all the time, then we would create an atmosphere of mass suspicion and skepticism. We would create division. And we'd never get anything done. This is actually the cultural climate we are living in now. A culture wherein small lies have proliferated or snowballed into an incalculable number of other falsehoods. The only way out from this web is to start being honest with both ourselves and others so we can start tearing apart this illusion together. Because we all buttress it together. We're the ones making it. So the second type of speech we need to avoid is slander. Now, it should be pretty self-evident as to why slander isn't good. It creates a disruption of social cohesion, and it breaks apart what was originally one. Our goal here is unity, not duality. So just don't do it. Talking shit doesn't help anyone. And it doesn't take an enlightened being to figure that one out. The next type of speech we need to avoid is harsh language. And that's language that is rooted in anger. Harsh language is bad because it's designed to cause suffering. And if you wish to inflict suffering on others, then you don't understand how this universe functions. As long as one person is suffering, all others will suffer. Period. The root of harsh or angry words, almost universally, stems from aversion. We get angry and we say "raka" to our brothers because their actions, their appearance, their thoughts, or whatever, don't match with our vision of how the world ought to be. So by insulting people or getting angry at them, we're really just showing our own insecurities. Now, the Buddha says, quote, Speak words that are loving and gentle, soothing to the ear in tone, and words that are courteous, friendly, and agreeable. So, the ideal antidote to harsh language is cultivating patience. That is, learning to accept criticism or blame from others, learning to sympathize with the shortcomings of others, learning to respect different points of view, and so forth. So, the next type of speech we have is idle chatter. Idle chatter is essentially pointless and vain talk. It's the use of words that lack any purpose or depth. It communicates nothing of value, and really it just makes you reveal your own ignorance. The Buddha taught that idle talk should be, as much as possible, restricted to matters of importance. In the case of the monk, his words should be selective and chiefly concerned with the path to enlightenment. Lay people generally have more need for small talk with their friends and their family in connection to things like their work, their hobbies, or whatnot. But even then, people ought to be mindful not to let their conversations stray into idle gossip, vain flights of fancy, elaborate plans for the distant future, and these kinds of things. So, the remedy for this is generally abstaining from doing it yourself. The people around you will subsequently tune in. Now, a problem which we face, which the Buddha and his disciples did not, is this constant bombardment of idle talk from television, radio, newspapers, social media, movies, games, etc. The constant need of stimulation from these sources ultimately leaves the mind vacant of its own content. It leaves it stuck in a rut of passive confusion. These various sources of media, since they typically depend on sensationalism to garner interest, have a tendency of also blunting our sensitivities toward more subtle things. So, in this regard, you should avoid discussing Kanye and the Kardashians as much as humanly possible. It's for your own good. So, now we're going to move away from right speech and on toward right action. Right action means refraining from harmful actions with respects to fulfilling your own biological needs. So, these three things are abstaining from taking life, abstaining from taking what isn't given, id est stealing, and abstaining from sexual misconduct. So, the first of these is in reference to what we eat. Quote unquote, abstaining from taking life is more than just refraining from murdering other humans. What the Buddha meant here was abstaining from killing any sentient being, any being endowed with mind or consciousness. To the Buddhists, this means humans, animals, and even insects. Apparently, plants are not considered to be sentient beings. That's something I disagree with. But, of course, if we didn't at least eat plants, there'd be none of us left. So, in any case, this whole principle is rooted in the concept that all living things love life and fear death. And that all seek happiness and thus are averse to pain. So the quote-unquote right thing to do is to abstain from inflicting fear, pain, and death on other sentient beings. So then, according to the Buddha, what's the antidote to our fiendish lust for killing and raping everything on four legs? Well, it's the development of kindness and compassion for other beings. If we try to put ourselves in the shoes of a dairy cow, we're less likely to torment it and more likely to live in symbiosis with it. Okay, so the next aspect of right action is this. Refraining from taking what is not given. In other words, thou shalt not steal. Of course, this doesn't apply to things which have no owner, like unclaimed wood or rocks or whatnot. But what's interesting is that there's a flip side to this. And it's just as bad of a transgression in the Buddhist mind to withhold from others what should rightfully be given to them. So the old trope of the beggar stealing bread to survive isn't really a moral conundrum to the Buddha, since there's a moral discrepancy at work on both sides. That of the store owner withholding, and that of the starving beggar stealing. So, the antidote to all of this is honesty, openness, or generosity, and contentment. If we give and are always satisfied with what we have no reason to take from others. So, our next aspect concerns abstaining from sexual misconduct. And for this particular point, I'm going to quote the Buddha and not leave it up to me to interpret it. Quote, "A disciple avoids sexual misconduct and abstains from it. He has no intercourse with such persons as are still under the protection of a father, a mother, a brother, sister, or relatives, nor with married women, nor with female convicts, nor lastly with betrothed girls." Now, monks and nuns are expected to be entirely celibate, since they practice renunciation as a full-time job of sorts. But in terms of general lay people, what we've got here is a few words against taking what is not yours. Now, obviously, there could be much said about women and their own sovereignty over their bodies and so forth, but, we can't let our modern prejudices hide what's at work under this injunction from the 6th century BC. All it's saying is, don't cause people pain with your sexuality. Don't steal people's fiancés or wives or destroy marriages. Don't abuse prisoners or slaves and that sort of thing. If you think you're causing someone harm with your sexuality, then stop. So, the antidote to sexual misconduct, at least for married lay people, is fidelity. When it comes to mature and mutually independent people entering into a sexual relationship through free consent, as long as nobody's being intentionally harmed, it's all free game. When it comes to ordained monks and nuns, however, they're obliged to observe celibacy. They need to abstain not only from sexual misconduct, but from sexual involvement in general, at least for the duration of their vows. The holy life aims toward a complete purity, an absence from desire, and this kind of thing requires turning one's back on the concept of sexual desire in general. There are, especially in men, a number of tantric traditions which have grown out of India, of which some focus on the retention of life force, or prana, in this case represented by sperm, in order to achieve heightened states of spiritual awareness. Let's just say I don't disbelieve the veracity of their claims at all concerning the effects of these practices. Now, let's move away from right action and on toward right lifestyle or livelihood. All of this is in reference to how you earn your living. Now remember, we're in a pre-market economy at this time that Siddhartha is sitting in the lotus position under his tree, but I'm pretty sure the Buddha's thoughts transcend the type of economy you're in when it comes to how to make a living ethically. According to the Buddha, wealth ought to be gained peacefully, without coercion or violence. One should acquire it honestly, not by trickery or fraud. And one should, and I hope now this should go without saying, acquire it in ways which do not entail harm and suffering. So, the Buddha mentions 5 specific kinds of jobs which harm others and thus are to be avoided. These are dealing in weapons, dealing in living beings. This includes raising animals for slaughter, as well as slave trade and prostitution. The next is dealing in meat production and butchery. After that, we've got selling poisons, and then selling alcohol. Okay, so the next part of the Noble Eightfold Path concerns right effort. Right effort has to do with the ways we allocate energy, or perhaps what I would call attention or care, which are essentially forms of spiritual currency in this universe. This is focused consciousness, the part of us that makes us human. And this is at the root of all desire, all aggression, all violence, all ambition. But then on the flip side, it's also at the root of all of our generosity, our self-discipline, our kindness, our understanding of one another. Our allocation of this conscious energy, then, can either be wholesome and productive or unwholesome and destructive. To allocate our conscious energy toward wholesome and productive modes is the so-called great work of spiritual alchemy. Your deliverance, your salvation, if you will, does not come from just believing in a story. It comes from working out all of your iniquities, from ironing out all of those kinks which make you disruptive, counterproductive, disorderly, and a source of suffering in general. We must all work out our own salvation, but this requires energy. And this isn't some airy-fairy New Age notion of energy that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is work. I'm trying to get this whole concept back to the etymological root of the word energy, which is the Greek energeia, which means action, act, or work. This comes from the adjective energos, which means active, and even that just constitutes of the two words en, which is in, and ergon, work. So energy just literally means at work. That's what this concept of right effort is about. It's about where are we putting our energies. This ought to be toward the cultivation of mind, since all is mind. That mind coming into matter starts out all mired in shit, in its base animalistic desires. That mind then, by the power of will, can be elevated out of that muck and brought into alignment with the principles which govern this universe. I think I mentioned in a previous lecture, and I warned you all that you should be, quote, careful to whom you give your attention. This is what this is all about, right? Effort is about taking your attention away from trivial things and putting them toward important things, of which there is most notably liberation. So next we have right mindfulness. And we could say that this is the part of the Eightfold Noble Path that concerns what we've come in the West to refer to as meditation. I remember once I did a Google search for meditation, and for some reason I misspelled the word and it said, "I'm sorry, did you mean medication?" So, mindfulness is essentially a presence of mind. It's attentiveness or awareness. In states of mindfulness, the mind is consciously kept at a level of bare attention. It's detached from what's happening within us and around us. The mind remains in the present, open, quiet, and also alert. Judgments and interpretations are suspended, and if they happen to arise, well, then you just note them down and then you drop them. This whole process is a way of coming back to what's at hand and of standing in that here and now without getting swept off by a tide of distracting notions. Now, we may generally assume we can do nothing but be aware of the present, but this is totally an illusion. Very rarely do people become aware of the present as outlined by the practices of mindfulness. Usually the mind begins somewhere in the present, then it quickly flies off using that impression of the present as a springboard for other mental constructs, which then totally removes it from the sheer immanence of sense data. The mind wanders within itself. So what generally happens is the mind grabs hold of an object free from conceptualization for about a millisecond, and then immediately it just launches off into a series of wild ideations by which the mind is attempting to interpret that object or make it intelligible vis-a-vis its own categories and assumptions. After all that has gone on, the original direct experience has been overrun by flights of fancy, and the actual object sitting in front of you appears through some dense layers of ideas. In the occult tradition, these layers of ideas, which obscure the real world, can be called planets or archons, and the soul, when detached from the body at death, has to move through these layers back toward pure mind, which is the world as it really is. The Buddha calls this process of mental construction papanka, which means elaboration, or maybe embellishment, or conceptual proliferation. Some might call it magic, but this is the process of making the simple world around you baroque with ideas. And really, this is all fine and good until someone's deluded mind, veiled in ignorance, starts to project its own internal constructs outwardly, sticking them onto our consensus reality as if such ideas really belonged to it. An extremely powerful example of this is the concept of race. In reality, there is just one race, a human race, given that we can all breed with one another. But many people are deluded into thinking that race is a real thing, and they thus affect reality by projecting their subjective classifications and taxonomies onto a languageless, objective world. So, right mindfulness. This is all about aligning yourself as best as possible to objective reality without deluding yourself into thinking you're more than purely subjective. Put simply, it's about seeing things as they are and not how we like them to be, consciously, actively, and intently. And this is not a passive endeavor. Of course, there's much more to be said about mindfulness, but this isn't a guide to meditation. You can find plenty of those elsewhere. This is just a guide to the life and thoughts of Gautama Buddha, as far as I know them. Okay, so this brings us to the 8th and final part of the Eightfold Noble Path, and this is right concentration. So, if you think of your mind like a tree, branching out in all directions. What the purpose of right concentration, or samadhi, is to bring all of these disparate branches into one steady and straight and rigid beam. In every act of mind, there is this central point holding them all together, like the basso continuo does in Baroque music. We want to align ourselves to that central point, that world axis, which ties together all experience. That's the source, and we want it to be the object of our concentration. It's about alignment with that speck of consciousness, which is at the heart of consciousness itself. The Buddha compares an untrained mind with a fish just taken out of the water. It flaps around hither and thither, and it flops about from one idea to the next with no sense of inner control. A mind like this is generally overwhelmed by worry and concern for countless things which likely will never come to pass, and then if they do, they'll be tolerated regardless. So, on the contrary, when the mind's been trained in concentration, it can remain focused on its object without distraction, and of course, that object in question is liberation. Now, let's get back to the Buddha, newly awakened, sitting beneath his Bodhi tree, realizing all of the stuff that I've just mentioned. Here, the now transcendent being, who was once a mere man, is said to have entered nirvana. The Buddha described nirvana as a state of perfect peace of mind, free from doubt, free from fear, free from ignorance and greed and hatred and all other afflictive states. Essentially, he experienced his very own eschaton, dying to his old self and awakening to the truth, which is all around us all the time. And now, here's the most important part of the story to me. Immediately after this awakening, the Buddha starts debating within himself whether or not he should teach the Dharma, the path of liberation, to others. He debated whether it was right to throw his pearls to swine. He was concerned that mankind was so generally overpowered by hate and ignorance and greed that they could never accept this toilsome path. In the end, the Buddha yielded to the path of compassion. He agreed to teach those who were willing to submit themselves to the path. He realized, as I've mentioned before, that a pearl trod upon by swine is still a pearl. That truth cannot be tarnished. Now, the Buddha's story doesn't end here. There's plenty more left to be said about his missionary activities, his taking on of disciples, the countless anecdotes of his travels, and, of course, his death. Unfortunately, we've gone well over our time for the day, and this will be something I may or may not pick up later. In closing, I want to share a poem of mine which fits into this whole theme. So, here it is. I've seen the great beyond and the spaces in between, the angels and the demons and the dreaming God machine, the stars within their vacuum and the trees within their breeze, the endless night sky falling and dear Atlas on his knees. I've seen the worn-out faces of men with withered dreams, in halls of endless mirrors, 'tween which dull light did gleam. I've seen the crumbling cities and pastures evergreen, the helpless and the shepherds as mere chessboard figurines. I've seen the light whence man did spring and the howling depths beyond. I've seen the way the hopeless cling and the way we've all been conned. For now, thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm your host, Dan Attrell.